Yes, over 10 minutes of talking about fishing lines. Who says YouTube content creation isn't glamorous?
A fishing man out on the lake. All you need is a line and a pole that'll never break.
Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great. Good. I get asked sometimes why I use different types of lines on my various reels. Most people use monofilament, arguably the most popular and versatile line, but I also make use of other kinds of lines. Why? Well, if you only tend to use monofilament line, you probably haven't noticed that the four main types of fishing line have different characteristics in the water, and by extension, how different types of lures function with them. Today, I'll go over those types of line, how they act in the water, and what kind of lures and presentations I think you should be using with them. First, we'll look at monofilament. Monofilament has a number of advantages besides being the cheapest out of the four. It has a good deal of stretch, which, if you snag as much as my brother-in-law does, you know well. It's reasonably good at being resistant to abrasion, that is, fraying or cutting, so it doesn't fail as easily as some of the other types of line if you run it across stuff like logs, heavy brush, or rocks. It's also more supple than most other lines. Finally, it tends to float. Of course, only God and my mother are perfect, so there are some downsides to monofilament as well. It has what's called memory, so that it remembers the shape of the reel it's on. So when it comes off your spool, it tends to be coiled. It's thicker than the other lines at the same strength as stated in pounds tests, so you'll get less of it on your reel. As an example, you could have a 20-pound test monofilament line that's the same diameter as 65-pound test braided line. That 20-pound braided line is equivalent in diameter to 8-pound monofilament. Also, you're going to have to change monofilament out more often as it is prone to UV damage from the sun. So what is it good for? Mono is an excellent line for things like topwater lures and pretty good for subsurface lures. I also tend to use it for things like spinner baits and buzz baits. Mono will eventually sink, but it does quite slowly due to the slow rate it absorbs water. Its extra thickness at the same strength as other types of lines also slows its descent due to increased resistance in the water. It's essentially the only line that floats. Now, I wouldn't use it for things like jerk baits and slash baits, as it may take a while to get the lure down to its proper depth. So next up is fluorocarbon line. The thing you'll immediately notice about fluoro is that it's relatively clear. It's also strong, so you can get away with using a smaller diameter line. It doesn't stretch at all, so it's more sensitive, less visible to fish, and it doesn't have the memory that monofilament does. Downsides, however, include that it abrades quite easily and is expensive compared to mono. It's also not much stronger than monofilament. I also find that knots fail more often with fluoro compared to any other kind of line. So why use fluoro? Well, as it's less visible to fish, it makes it pretty darn good to use as a leader, particularly if you use something like braid as your main line. Also, it's slightly thinner at the same strength as mono, so you can fit more of it on your reel. Also, it sinks fairly well, again because of the thinner diameter offering less resistance. So it's good for deeper presentations. Good presentations to use with fluorocarbon are things like jerk and slash baits, spy baits, and anything that you want to sink down. Generally, most suspended baits are probably best on fluorocarbon. So next we have braided line. As with fluorocarbon, it's more expensive than monofilament, though less so than fluorocarbon. Its key strength is that it's strong at its test pound weight. If you have a snag that not even God can free, and a braided line strong enough that you can't break it by pulling, I can assure you, you will be cutting that line. It's also quite thin compared to monofilament at the same test strength, has absolutely no stretch, and the result is that it's very sensitive. It also sinks better than monofilament lines, so it's good for deeper presentations. With the appropriate leader, something like fluorocarbon, it's pretty good for things like finesse presentations, which include drop shots. Along with the upside, there are some downsides. It's better than fluorocarbon at this, but braid isn't great at abrasion resistance. It's also quite visible compared to fluorocarbon and monofilament. If you get a bird's nest with braid, it may take God's intercession to clear it. One thing that you may hear as a negative is that it can also act like a saw and over time potentially damage the line guides on your rod. That was true back in the 1990s when braided lines tended to have Kevlar in them. But these days, you honestly don't need to worry about that. So what is it good for? Well, despite not being great with abrasion resistance, braided line is probably your best bet when it comes to fishing in areas where it's actually likely to occur, largely due to its lack of stretch and its strength. That lack of stretch means that you're more likely to set the hook when it comes to things like fishing frog lures and jigs. You can cast it a country mile thanks to its thin diameter, not being subject to too much wind resistance. And because it's pretty thin, you can let fish run for a while and not worrying about running out of line. So finally, we've got copolymer line. It's an improved version of monofilament line, but as you heard me say before, it's more expensive than monofilament. It's abrasion resistant and thinner at the same strength as mono. It's also less visible, but it is as supple as mono. Finally, as it has a lower stretch than monofilament, a fish hitting that lure hard is more likely to break copolymer. The downside is that it's more visible than fluorocarbon. You can use copolymer for many of the same presentations as monofilament, such as topwater lures. It can also double for fluorocarbon, but again, it's more visible. You can also fish it for deeper presentations since it does sink well and it's fine for suspended lures. If you're using monofilament, should you switch to copolymer? If you want to spend the extra money, I ain't gonna stop you, but I still use monofilament lines for the appropriate lure presentations, and I haven't had any issues. That said, if you want to spend the extra money and fish in things like tournaments, copolymer may be your choice. It's important to remember that you can mix and match all of these lines. I tend to run braided line on most reels, but use an appropriate leader for the presentation I'm employing. For example, my topwater setups all run braided line, but they have fairly long monofilament leaders. My jerkbait setup also has braid, but I run a pretty long fluorocarbon leader so I can take advantage of its sinking capability. And because neither has stretch, I maintain those sensitivity and hook setting strengths. That said, if you only want to run fluorocarbon on your jerkbait rod, that's fine too. Just remember that, you should use a good knot when tying on leaders, and lucky for you, I have a video that I recently released on that very topic. Well, that was a lot of talk about fishing lines, wasn't it? I don't know if it was as clear as fluor or opaque as braided line. Hopefully the former. If you have any questions or suggestions, there's a comments section below. I'd actually love to hear from you. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. And as always, I hope your lines are always tight. Take care, and bye-bye.